Welcome. I think we're going to start now. Let me get our speaker view in place. Gallery view, speaker view. Hi, welcome to a walkthrough of Portals, Stories, and Other Journeys, an exhibition currently on view at Tai Kwun Contemporary Art Space in Hong Kong. For those of you who have never been to Hong Kong, or those of you who have not been to Hong Kong recently, Tai Kwun is a wonderful Herzog de Meuron designed art exhibition space in the newly renovated or recently renovated Hong Kong Central Police Station. It's right in the center of Hong Kong. It's a wonderful location, and if people haven't gone there, we'll hopefully have the opportunity soon to go back to Hong Kong. Please do. This exhibition stems from Asia Art Archive's research since 2014 into the personal archive of the late Hong Kong-based artist Ha Bik Chuen. Let me introduce myself. My name is Jane Debevoise. I'm the chair of Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong and New York. Asia Art Archive in America, which is where we're broadcasting from today, is the mini hub of Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong. We are both in Hong Kong and in New York, a nonprofit library or reading room, a vast digital archive, and a research platform focused on recent art from Asia. Joining me live tonight is Michelle Wong. It's her early morning, our night. For those of you who don't know, but I think many of you do, Hong Kong is 12 hours ahead of us. Michelle is the curator of this remarkable exhibition and a long-term colleague of mine and ours at Asia Art Archive. Michelle is a PhD in art history at the University of Hong Kong, and from 2012 to 2020, she was a researcher at Asia Art Archive in Hong Kong with a focus on Hong Kong art history and histories of exchange and circulation through exhibitions and periodicals. Her full bio, which is now I see in the chat, is available on our website and also in the chat on the side of the screen right now. We'll start the event tonight by hearing directly from Michelle about this project. She's going to introduce the project and also the Ha Archive and Mr. Ha. Then we will watch a 30-minute or roughly 30-minute walkthrough made specially for us, or I think we're test driving this virtual walkthrough, which is narrated by Michelle. And then we will open up to questions. Now, regarding the questions, it's very important that all of you know that you are welcomed, encouraged, and if you were sitting in the room, I'd be asking you to ask questions directly, but please ask lots of questions. It's an opportunity to speak to Michelle directly. We have about 20 minutes or 15, 20 minutes reserved for that. But before I hand the mic over to Michelle, these questions, write them down, put them in the chat, or no, sorry, put them in the Q&A, and we will get to as many as possible. The event, I must say, is being recorded. The recording has already begun, and we'll be posting the video on our website in a few days, so that if you want to revisit the talk and the video, you can do that at any time in the future. We will also, for those of you who are listening in from Facebook, which a lot of people do, we have our colleagues who are watching the Facebook feed, and if you have any questions, you can ask them there, and they will relay them to us on this platform. So now, Michelle, if you're ready, I would like you to join me on screen. Hi, nice to see you.
I'm Jane. Good morning, everyone. It's so early.
It's really wonderful to see you. Michelle, it's very early. I don't know if you've had your cup of tea yet, but it's wonderful to see you. And I look forward to all that you're going to tell us about your work on the Ha Bik Chuen archive. Thank you all in the audience for joining us tonight. And I look forward to seeing you again after the video and when Michelle and I will join for a Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane, for the introduction, and thank you, Hillary, for sort of organizing everything and taking such good care of us. I'm very excited to be sort of sharing this exhibition with everyone, and of course doing this in a pre-recorded walkthrough is a first, and so it's going to be really interesting. We'd love to hear your feedback and all of that. And before we go into the video, maybe I'll say a few words about the Ha Bik Chuen archive, as well as the exhibition that we've put together, sort of three and a half years in the making, including all of the delay and all that. So you hear a little bit about this also in the video, that, you know, Ha Bik Chuen was a late Hong Kong artist who was first born in Guangdong and then moved to Hong Kong. And he was self-taught, so he never really went to art school. And so the way that we think about the huge archive that he left behind was very much as a tool of self-teaching, self-instruction. And he did so by collecting different kinds of printed matter, ephemera, and often cutting them up and putting into different boxes that became his reference for other works and other projects. He also started photographing exhibitions around the 1980s. And that sort of was the crux of AAA's work with Ha Bik Chuen's archive, which is exhibition history, and using that to sort of provide and create this resource for writing Hong Kong art history is very much around our work. So Ha Bik Chuen's archive, studio archive collection of stuff was first stored in one of his apartments on the top floor of a walk-up in Kowloon in Hong Kong. And we started work on that in that apartment at invitation of the family. And around 2016, we actually relocated the entire archive to a project space that is in an industrial area, from where we sort of ran a 5-year project where we organized the materials, digitized them, and also ran residencies with curators, scholars, and artists, and also used as material to collaborate with universities for teaching. So we've already kept that collection of materials open for use and for activation while we were organizing it, which had sort of created some really pleasant surprises. And, you know, sometimes it was just chaos because everything was everywhere. But through that process, we actually learned a lot from the materials as well as from the people who were working on it. And it's something that I think, you know, for myself, and I think for a lot of my former colleagues as well, have left a lasting impression on our creative and intellectual lives. One question that people ask is, where are the materials now? The project with Ha Bik Chuen's archive has now since finished, and the materials have gone to different institutions, including AAA.
I think we might have lost Michelle. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the video, and hopefully she'll be able to join us later. Okay. She might have been having some connection problems. So popping in from behind the scenes to say we're going to go ahead and start the video walkthrough led by Michelle of the Ha Bik Chuen exhibition at Tai Kwun, and then hopefully within 20 minutes or so when it's over, Michelle will be able to join us again. So we're going to go get started. Thank you.
Portal Stories and Other Journeys is an exhibition departing from Asia Art Archive's work on the archive of the late Hong Kong artist Ha Bik Chuen. You may ask, who was Ha Bik Chuen? He was an artist who lived and worked in Hong Kong. He was born in Guangdong in 1925, came to Hong Kong via Macau in 1957, and passed away in Hong Kong in 2009. During his lifetime, Ha mostly made prints and sculptures, and he also took photographs. He was an artist who never went to art school and left behind a huge archive that included over 100,000 photographic prints of people, things, and events. At the invitation of Ha Bik Chuen's family, AAA started working on Ha's archive in 2014. And this project is a very valuable one for us to work on because of the exhibition history that Ha documented, which we see as a key resource for writing Hong Kong's art history. While we're working on Ha's archive, we've already sort of opened it up to for activation and animation of it with artists, scholars, and curators. And this leads us to this current exhibition, which explores the archive as a space of creativity and inquiry. And we do this by restaging historical objects, archival documents, as well as commissioning new works by contemporary artists. And the exhibition includes commissions by artists Banu Cennetoğlu, Lam Wing Sze, Kwan Sheung Chi, Raqs Media Collective, and Walid Rad. Staged as mini theatrical sets, these works, as well as our selection from Ha Bik Chuen's archive, guide us to explore our sense of scale, of self, and of history. And as we walk through this exhibition, you'll see this archive unfold from 2D into 3D form. Many of us who are not art people may still be wondering who Ha Bik Chuen was. Sure, we know he was a sculptor and a printmaker, but what were his works actually like? Ha's first work that was collected by the Hong Kong Museum of Art was called Construction, made and collected in 1967. This work was collected and displayed as a wall-based work, but one day when we were looking into Ha's archive, we found this coded box that says restaurant decoration. And inside this box was a photograph of an interior of a restaurant. The restaurant is now demolished, but on the ceiling of that restaurant is a decoration that looked very much like Ha's 1967 work. And in 1960s and 70s Hong Kong, it was not uncommon for artists to not only make art, but also produce for places such as hotels and restaurants. We went on to borrow construction from the Hong Kong Museum of Art, proposing this current way of installing the work from the ceiling. For us, this set literally shows us other frameworks to look at how Ha's work can exist. One of the most exciting discoveries we made working on Ha's archive was his collage practice, which was not known to the public until 6 years after his death. What you're seeing on the walls are projections of Ha's collage books, and the giant's hand that flipped them belonged to our colleagues who processed these books. The pages we're looking at are weirdly seamless, but it is also clearly visible that they are composed of different images pasted onto the book. And when you flip through these books, you almost cannot control yourself but to touch the edges of the cutouts to see if they really are pasted onto the page. The story was that actually AA didn't find these collage books. It was the artist Walid Rad who found them when he visited us as an artisan resident in 2014. So we took Walid to Ha's studio at the time, and he pulled out one of these interior design books and asked, what is this and why are these pages completely covered with collages? At that time, we were completely speechless. We had overlooked these books because we were so focused on looking for the exhibition histories in Ha's archive that we could use to write art history. And we had forgotten that when artists make archiving part of their practice, the archive must go over to beyond straightforward documentation and linear history. The archive has to be a creative space, and in this case, pages become walls and walls become pages. What we can also see through Ha's collages is also Hong Kong's history through publications, as Ha collected different printed matter throughout his life and sort of cut them out and put them into boxes. In some of these collage books, it almost looked like Ha was beside himself and had to rehang pictures inside the spaces portrayed in the interior design books. In some of them, he was almost like rewriting art history by inserting non-Euro-American images into what is known as a Western art canon. By the time we had finished processing Ha's archive in 2020, there were over 300 of these modified books. The earliest of them dating 1958, the year after Ha settled in Hong Kong with his family, and the latest of them 2009, the year Ha passed away. Take a look on the horse on your left and the shadow of what looks like a half fish, half human creature on your right. We'll come back to both of them later. So we found the collage books in Ha's studio, and Ha's archive was left in his in To Kwon Wan for years before it was moved to a project space in Pho Tan for processing. Before that move happened, the archive seemed to be static, but it was slowly falling apart. At some point, the concrete ceiling of the apartment started falling, and we had to cover bits of the archive with Tyvek in order to prevent further damage. When Raqs visited Ha's studio in 2016, the archive was in this state, its fragments permitting us to experience it spatially, but it could just disappear like any moment of history. Raqs was struck by this haphazardness and awkward intimacy and decided to transfer and transform this affective register into a work in this exhibition. And this affective register is not so simply, it cannot be displayed so easily through archival documents. So Raqs transformed this feeling of awkward intimacy that they felt intensely into a composite creature that you see. The creature has a sofa component, it has a pre-stitched Tyvek as its skin, and an LED panel at its back that emanates primarily color fields that strewn the thinking studio before we transferred it to Pho Tan. A table fan murmurs. Raqs describes the pictures that they looked at from the archive, and one of the lines goes like this: when a photograph is a photograph of a photograph of a photograph, meaning is possible only when promises begin to break. The work we see now in front of us is a multi-channel video installation by Lam Wing Sze, an artist who works with photograph and video. Sze is a good 70 years younger than Ha, and this means that the kinds of technology that she has access to and are comfortable with are very different from what Ha used. The visual sources that Sze and Ha read and found resonating may also be very different. So our invitation to Sze for this exhibition is to think about how it could be possible for an artist to inhabit and contemplate the practice of another who is so differently from her. And in this work, Sze revisited sites that Ha frequented when he was still alive and took sound recordings from those places. And she also remixed photographs and sources from Ha's archive to form her own sequence. She also included images and footage from the now that she took, but this is quite barely visible when you look at the entire installation. And through this entire remixing, Sze offers her own commentary and critique of another artist's practice in a meditative manner. This set is called An Archivist's Table, and through this we want to present a space where questions are continuously posed, and also it offers a space where we can present a selection of exhibition documentation that Ha created. But before we look at the two arcs of tables, what we see are a shelf from Pho Tan that we installed to remind us of where the materials came from. And the serial numbers of the boxes refer to the 30 boxes of photographic materials that we packed out from Ha's archive during our processing. And sometimes the materials look back at us through the eyelets. Another thing that we thought a lot about when putting this exhibition together was how to bring Ha, the artist, back into the exhibition, which is so much about his archive now instead of him. And we end up doing so by creating a video from the point of view of a scanner, scanning Ha's writing, manuscripts, as well as drawing. And it ended up being a very ghostly, lingering presence. And the the A4 size red zine that you're looking at is the creation of our colleagues Samantha Chow and Stephen Lam, who turned the complete book list of Ha's personal library into the zine you're looking at. The zine and the book list was possible to compile because every single volume inside Ha's personal library has been gifted to different individuals and institutions. And this library, which was not only part of Ha's personal archive, but a very, very important part of his self-teaching practice, now find new lives in other people's personal libraries. The zine has no front cover or back cover, much like learning has no beginning or end. And on the left side of the zine, you see this sort of very small type font, and it's where the book are listed. And on the right, which is the red pages, there are excerpts of conversations that people had when they encountered Ha's library and the musings that they shared with us as they were taking the books away. One of the 10 sets in this exhibition is a discursive program developed by the artist Banu Cennetoğlu with AAA's very own Özge Ersoy for the past 2 years. It's titled Bewitched, Bewildered, Bothered, and this project asks questions around working with posthumous archives, and these questions are not so easily manifest in exhibitionary form. From June 15th to 17th, we, as part of Bewitched, Bewildered, Bothered, we screened a couple of films. One of them is The Proposal by Jill Margit, and the other one, Narcisista Organ Player by Narcisista, as a way to interrogate some of these questions that we want to ask. We also organized 3 panels of conversations, one between Özge, myself, and Banu, one with Jill, and another with Paul B. Preziato. And through these few days, we moved through various questions surrounding the legacies of those who are dead. Some of them happen to be artists. We also considered notions of access and use to how the position of the body, legalities, and copyright play out as we sometimes find ourselves dealing with dead people's stuff. These conversations are recorded, and you can find them on AAA's website. And as part of Banu's project, we also included a publication, which is the first ever English translation from Turkish of the chapter The Obvious Double Bind, which is a chapter from the book The Share of the Silent by the literary critic Nurdan Gurbilek. And this text is a foundational reference for Banu's artistic contribution, which you can also again download from AAA's website. Throughout the 7 years that we worked on Ha's archive, we've consulted and learned from many different projects and books that others have done, and these projects are very inspiring for us. We've therefore selected some of these extended reading and put them on display, which you can see here. And the architecture model here you see is a contribution from our exhibition architects, Sarah Lee and Yu Takayano. They've been working with us for this project since 2014 and followed very closely how Ha's archive and studio evolved. They even designed our full-time project space as the project changed as well. This model that they made is based on Ha's documentation of the studio in 1986, and we've also placed it next to reproductions of the photograph that Ha took. Throughout the exhibition, we paid a lot of attention to how the same image can appear in different forms, how one picture can appear on a document in one place and appear as a sculpture or a 3-dimensional work in another. And here you see Ha Bik Chuen's 1967 work Construction again, and this time in its original exhibition catalog, while we've seen it earlier as part of the restaurant set. This story is about Hong Kong artists realizing what they could not do in Hong Kong, but they could do elsewhere, this time in Manila. In 1982, one of the largest exhibitions of contemporary Hong Kong art took place in Manila. There were over 100 works by 16 artists on show at the Metropolitan Museum in Manila, and Ha was one of the participants. This little-known exhibition is important to Hong Kong's art history because not only was it a large show, it was also an exhibition that challenges many misconceptions we may have about both Hong Kong and Manila. Hong Kong at the time didn't really have a fully developed art infrastructure, but Manila did. So the Met in Manila was already a few times bigger than the Hong Kong Museum of Art or the Hong Kong Art Center, which are the prime exhibition spaces in Hong Kong at the time. And like I said, Ha was one of the exhibition participants, and therefore he documented it extensively. Through Ha's documentation of this exhibition, we get to see a more playful, personal side of many Hong Kong artists. In this image, we see artist Antonio Mack, who most of us in the art would know as the sculptor who died very young, horsing around with another artist. They were actually pretending to be a work that Antonio made called Horse and Ladder. And the horse is, of course, a very important motif in Hong Kong art because of the city's love for horse racing. Horse and Ladder became lost after 1982, and Antonio died in 1994. And this is when Ha's archive becomes important, and that how it opens up not the past, but the present and possible future. Fast forward in 2008, the artist Kwan Sheung Chi was looking for Antonio's Horse and Ladder in order to make a new commission for a retrospective to pay homage to Antonio. Horse and Ladder was nowhere to be found, and Kwan Sheung Chi in response replaced the ladder in Horse and Ladder with a barricade to represent the obstruction he experienced. And the work is titled Iron Horse. Fast forward again in 2020, Kwan Sheung Chi saw Ha's photos of Horse and Ladder in Manila and decided to cast the Iron Horse into bronze. And if you're looking for the vitrine here, you'll see Kwan Sheung Chi's Iron Horse on the other side. This is the photo documentation of an exhibition titled Being Minorities, which was curated by Oscar Ho, who at the time was the exhibition director of Hong Kong Arts Center. Being Minorities explores how British political power diminished in Hong Kong after the handover to Chinese sovereignty, when the ethnically Chinese population became the dominant force. Other non-Chinese communities in the city continue to be marginalized, invisible within mainstream media and discourse. In response, Oscar invited various contemporary artists to participate in this exhibition. But this exhibition, I guess, is important and interesting for us because of how some of the participants would become AA's collaborators years later. Here, Vivan Sundaram, Vudantan, and Robert O'Brien are seen in the same picture. Vivan and Vudantan would donate their archives to AAA in 2010 and 2012, respectively. And we would speak to Robert O'Brien for an extensive interview on Hong Kong's art history in 2015. If in the collage books we looked at, Ha was rewriting art history, inserting Hong Kong's history into Western art, then what we're looking at here is a history that we are still trying to discover and understand fully. You may have seen this figure in a different place, completely falling apart. But Lo Ting, this half-fish, half-human creature, was first introduced at the cusp of Hong Kong's handover back to China in 1998, again by Oscar Ho, through a series of exhibitions at the Hong Kong Arts Center. This series of exhibitions, and in particular one titled New Lo Ting, Archaeological Find, is one that has sort of captured our imagination and speculation continuously. In this exhibition, Oscar turned the entire exhibition site of Hong Kong Arts Center into a mock archaeological excavation site, where artists are not only makers of the objects on display, but also archaeologists who were discovering these objects. In this exhibition, Lo Ting was introduced as a mythical ancestor of people who live in Hong Kong. This half-fish, half-human creature lived both in water and on land, and people said you see it most on Lantau Island. But really, most of us have only seen Lo Ting in photographs by Ha or sort of heard about it through other hearsay. So it seems appropriate that actually in this exhibition, you see its shadow first before you actually encounter the sculpture. So in the attempt of restaging the archive in the physical form, we went looking for the original sculpture of Lo Ting, this figure that emanated from a confused archaeology and a confused history. And of course, we found it in Oscar's office in the university. And we also found out that the original sculpture was crafted by a stage prop designer, Jimmy Kung, and it was in very bad shape. So after some discussion, we decided to reproduce it here in fiberglass, a smooth, brand new existence, standing behind a screen with the projection of a mountain that might have been Lantau Island. So it's almost like Oscar and Jimmy are also artists for this exhibition, only that they've made this work 20 years before we had a chance to commission them. In this touchscreen TV, there are over 3,500 contact sheets that Ha kept as an index of exhibition histories. They are hand annotated, saying which exhibition happened which year, and was organized chronologically by Ha himself. Here we've transformed the analog material into a digital sensibility through a touchscreen interface that our very own Paco Ma of AAA in Hong Kong programmed with open source software, so thank you very much, Paco. And with these contact sheets, you basically have a bird's eye condensed view of Hong Kong's art ecology from the moment when Ha bought his first camera in 1980. This body of historical information that's very much from Ha's subjective point of view around Hong Kong's art ecology will continue to impact the writing of Hong Kong's art history for a long time to come. We're going to end our tour of Porto Stories and Other Journeys with the first work we encountered in the exhibition space but didn't speak about, which is the work by Walid Rad. The problem of the archive is often what to include and what to exclude, what to keep and what not to keep. But for Ha, it may perhaps be more about what to capture with the camera and what not to capture with the camera, what to cut out from which magazine and which box to put it in. Here you see on this sort of big crate with tiny little boxes and many little mini Ha figures. It's Ha being photographed with his work, with other people's work, Ha being at exhibitions, or Ha photographing someone else photographing something. All these Ha figures are actually selected from Ha's archive, which then we sort of manipulated to different sizes and stacked in different ways. And the more you look at them, the more it seemed unclear whether these many Ha Bik Chuens are jumping out of the boxes or going back into the boxes. What is also very interesting looking at this work is you see how sort of this chain of events and reaction of art, artist, display, viewer, and reproduction are all squeezed into one through Ha's documentation practice and archive. And Walid's work here sort of restages it very, very succinctly. I'm always very interested and sort of intrigued to hear how other people think and write about Ha. And I'll read a little extract from Walid's email to me a few years ago. And it goes like this. Ha seems to me, to Walid, quite alienated from himself. He's also quite disembodied here, even as we see his body everywhere. But the body that emerges is a series of layers, distinct layers. Artwork by Ha, Ha as artist, Ha as friends of artists, Ha as viewer of art, other artists as Ha, equally disembodied even as they have bodies themselves. And my favorite line, of course, is the end of this email that says, maybe that's why collage suits Ha so well.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Jane. Sorry about that. I think my internet dropped when I was about to thank people.
That's quite all right. You can thank them now, quickly.
Yeah, I think, we would just like to thank the China Cam group for supporting our exhibition. as well as Tai Kwun Contemporary, and most important of all, the people who we work together, especially Vivian Pun, Joey Wong, and Mark Trung. So that's really it.
No, it's great. I know, just so that everybody knows, Michelle and I have known each other for a very long time. So I witnessed the beginning of this, and it's so nice to see it come to this kind of exhibition, but there are many people involved. But I think it's safe to say that Michelle really was the champion, the leader, the driver of this project. But I think, you know, again, there's so many people involved. It was it's a great joint project. Michelle, there's several questions in the Q&A, but what I do want to just ask, I mean, let me just ask a question, and I think you ended so nicely with Walid's email, and the issue, the sort of surprise we all had when he found the collage books, which we had all overlooked because we were so focused on finding exhibition histories and looking through the photographs and trying to assemble them in some kind of historical narrative or historical timeline. And then, as an artist does and would, he randomly picks a book off the bookshelf and sees something that we've never seen before. I think that's a metaphor for the way artists think. There's a willingness to take risks and go off the beaten path. And I think the way you talked about it, a collage being a wonderful way of thinking of Ha's life and archives in general as collages in some way, of layers, of accretions, of interventions. I think that was a wonderful insight. But I do, as I mentioned to you earlier, I do want, you had a wonderful interview again in something called South, I guess, was a online magazine that I just read this afternoon. And I thought some of the ways you answered questions in it were really very fascinating. And in that interview, you asked yourself, think about, when does a collection of stuff, we all have collections of stuff, become an archive? You know, many people don't even, you know, when you say the word archive, I mean, I don't think it necessarily immediately comes to mind as exactly what we're talking about. So when does a collection of stuff become an archive with a small a? And when does it become an archive with a capital A? And, you know, in regards to all the work and you and your colleagues have done on the Ha project, let's call it a project further, when did this collection of stuff become an archive with a small a and a big A? And how have you, how's your work with this changed your own thinking about archives and archiving?
Yeah, thank you, Jane. Incredibly difficult question, but I think, you know, when South sort of asked me about, you know, this fascination of people having sort of looking at Ha's stuff and archive, thinking that, oh, the way that he organized things seems to blur documentation and archive and art. I think this was something that I can speak for myself, but I'm also pretty sure that my colleagues at the time, we were all very sort of struck by that. And it has never really, we've never forgotten that as we organize these things, what we're actually doing, we're disciplining the stuff to behave a certain way. We have to make a decision to say this photograph goes there, this magazine goes there. And something happens in that process. And I think, you know, maybe that's when the time when the stuff becomes an archive with a small a. And when you work, you know, as part of an institution, there's a larger mandate. Say, for example, for the Ha Bik Chuen project, it was, you know, to organize and provide access of this resource for other people to use. So I think with that sort of bigger mandate, it then becomes an archive with a big A as well. I don't remember the exact date, but I have registered this moment when we start calling Ha Bik Chuen's archive the Ha Bik Chuen archive, and I made a mental note, okay, so the big A has happened now. But I think throughout the process when, you know, the larger team was sort of working on Ha's stuff, we've always tried to sort of carve out space and time to discuss the things that we found interesting things that were difficult to discipline and things that seemed to want to belong to more than one place. And I think that's sort of our way of constantly reminding ourselves that, you know, it has other existence as well, the collection of stuff. And, you know, it's really with the people and your discussion and this exchange of ideas that it stays alive that way.
I think that's a, you know, it's a wonderful idea as a mother of many children, particularly unruly boys, the idea of disciplining the stuff, making them behave. It is an impossibility, I hope you all know out there, but I think it's, I think it's a wonderful way of thinking about a certain kind of responsibility as we set the archive forward into society for you know, general use or easy access. And so at some level, asking it to behave, but not necessarily curtailing its creativity is an interesting and delicate balance. We have a question from the chat. We have lots of questions, but we have a question early on that says, it seems like Ha's archive is uniquely large and comprehensive when it comes to post-war, World War II, Hong Kong art. Are there comparable formal archives of Hong Kong art, whether in Hong Kong or the UK or China? Did the Hong Kong Museum of Art ever create a library? What about Hong Kong universities? It is unusual that one of the best archives of Hong Kong art, or seemingly the best archives of Hong Kong art, has been made by an artist as a private creative project and not an institution. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the Hong Kong Museum of Art has their own resource center, and in fact, it's a very, it's a resource that we've used a lot. You know, like before we started working on Ha Bik Chuen's archive, we actually collaborated with the Hong Kong Museum of Art to sort of create a series of oral history, as well as sort of exhibition files of the artists and people that we spoke to. And, you know, we spoke of this project as like a hacking project, hacking back into the Museum of Art's resource center and archive, because, you know, it's not so easily accessible, but the stuff is there. And since then, the Museum of Art has actually digitized a lot of their stuff and put it online. And so, you know, they may not have that much of a visibility as, you know, the way that we've been able to circulate the Ha Bik Chuen archive, because that's in the conception of the very project itself. You know, it has to be seen in order for people to know that it can be used. So no, actually the Museum of Art has a really, really pretty amazing archive, as well as the University of Hong Kong. Professor David Clark, before he retired, you know, for a number of years ran a Hong Kong art archive. There's another art and literature archive of sorts in the Chinese University of Hong Kong as well. So there are these resources that, you know, but maybe they do not speak to one another in the way that we wish them to be. But with a little work and digging and reading of maps, it's actually, there's a lot there.
And there's also the wonderful Hong Kong Film Archive.
Yeah.
Which also, and altogether, it'll be, you know, it's a fantastic resource for all of you out there to start to pull these pieces together. A question coming in from one of our colleagues who says, Lisa Robbins posed, how do you think the archive impacted his own work, his own creative work, or his work impacted what he collected? So, you know, what was there a feedback loop? How do you think his archiving or his collecting practice impacted his own art practice, and vice versa?
Thank you. That's a really great question. I think, you know, the most visible sort of feedback loop is how he collected the visual reference materials, and then those went into the collage books. But the funny thing was, Ha probably didn't see his collage practice as art during his lifetime, but he kept it sort of private. So when Walid found the artist books, those collage books, the first thing we went around was to ask people who knew Ha very well whether they've seen these books or not. And the answer was a resounding no. No one has ever seen it. And And so actually earlier this week, we were doing another walkthrough for colleagues in India. And we were discussing how this collage practice, as well as the documentation practice, I guess, of taking photographs of not just exhibitions, but also things and people, events, random sidewalk. These both have become sort of shadow practices that were not, that hadn't put out publicly as his art practice. And actually, personally, I think those are the closest between sort of his archiving and documenting and what would now be seen as a creative practice. But of course, there were also, you know, things that he collected that are sculptural forms that, yeah, you can say that it also impacted his prints and his sculptures as well. Yeah.
I also think it's wonderful to remember how thin or how undeveloped in some ways the art infrastructure at the time, that artists such as him, you know, really didn't have access to art schools. And not only that, some of the places where one could see art, and I remember back in the day, was in hotels and restaurants. So yeah. I think it's wonderful that you brought that in as one of the possible context for public access to art in the 50s and 60s and later.
And one thing about traveling as well, I think, you know, when we are doing art historical research, you know, the Rockefeller grants, the Ford Foundation grants are often sort of signs that we look for when an artist sort of get access to a different kind of art discourse, often in Euro-America. And Ha, you know, didn't travel until the early 80s. And one of the first places that he went to was in mainland China, in Huangshan, the Yellow Mountains. And Hong Kong's first Rockefeller grantee was Han Chi-fan, and he went to New York in 1969. I was comparing some of their timelines, Han and Ha. Ha and Han were born in the same year, but by 1969, Ha Bik Chuen was married with 3 children and probably mortgages, and Han was married but without children. So I think these are also sort of aspects that we can consider in terms of an artist's mobility and therefore sort of their opportunities afterwards.
No, I think that's very fair, and I think it's interesting. Tintin Wulia, who you probably know, an artist from Indonesia, who's also extremely interested in archives and excavating invisible histories, has a good question for you. It says, Michelle, you touched on the bit on the exhibition in Manila, which I think is very interesting, as well as the handover. Would you elaborate a bit further on how the archive relates to a larger constellation of state, regional, and world histories? One of the things I think that was a discovery as we went through this is that Hong Kong art was being circulated in Manila at a time when we didn't fully understand those kinds of connections and those kinds of possibilities for visibility and communication. And as you mentioned, that this was sort of a wider regional initiative at that time in bringing artists from around the region. So.
Right, thank you, Tintin. Yeah, I think, you know, the Manila episode is a very interesting case to look at how abstraction or abstract art is being circulated or being looked at in Southeast Asia, and I think it complicates the narrative of that it's a U.S. capitalist bloc sort of situation, because in Hong Kong during the Cold War period, it was a bit more. There's a lot of confluence in terms of that. It's very close to communist China, but also has influence from the UK as well as from the US. And if you look at the primary documents for Hong Kong artists who are making sort of that modernist sort of abstract work, it's not necessarily they were thinking that way. Actually, there was a lot of sort of shared resonances with people who were in Taiwan. And when these sort of abstract art from Hong Kong were shown in Manila as early as in the 60s, some of the comments was that this is too Chinese to be abstract. So there's a completely sort of different sort of framing of what Hong Kong artists who happen to be ethnically Chinese ought to be doing. And the fact that these artists showed in Manila throughout the 60s and 70s and therefore 80s, it actually creates a very different constellation of looking at sort of artists who created abstract art, but were framed differently, probably were creating works or creating these exchanges with a different framework in mind. And I think it definitely maps a different constellation of the regional and also the international. And it's just, there's so much there to be done. And it really does challenge, you know, you have a different perspective of art history from a different location, even if you're looking at a similar position of aesthetics or visual language, so to say.
And just out of curiosity, I mean, that exhibition that you saw where Vavan and O'Brien were in attendance, who sponsored that exhibition, out of curiosity? Do you remember?
So that was the Hong Kong Arts Center in 1998. So that's the cups of the handover, the second half of the question. And Oscar was the exhibition director of Hong Kong Arts Center at the Mind. And Oscar's curatorial practice, you know, was truly sort of eye-opening that way, in that he employs, you know, uses art as a mode of inquiry to look into injustices and questions in the social that, you know, may or may not have solutions, but can give a different sort of perspective, again, a different layer. And so that was 1998, at the Hong Kong Arts Center, where, you know, artists from different parts of the world, you know, in a slightly problematic way too, were called to sort of represent the different ethnicities within Hong Kong. But I think, you know, what truly is quite interesting for me is how Oscar was using the curatorial and exhibition making to sort of lay open these issues that are in Hong Kong that still prevailing.
Great. And just so that everybody knows who's on this call, it's Oscar Ho, who is also happens to be on the board of Art Archive, but more importantly, he is a curator, writer, critic, and an artist, and one of the most important sort of spokesmen for Hong Kong art at that now, and certainly at that period of time, and was the director of the Hong Kong Arts Center for an extended period of time. We have 4 more minutes. We have, again, a number of questions. I'm trying to figure out, you know, let's talk about Oscar for a second here. A question from Ho-Ten, who says, why is it so important to reproduce the Fishman statue in the center of your exhibition? Now we were talking about it. And let me just ask you, I said it's very convincing that Lo Ting might have been the ancestor of Hong Kong people. So I mean, you know, I think that the fact that you're saying that it's imaginary is somewhat questionable. Sounds very, very
We should all go back and ask Oscar, so what were you thinking? Actually, there is Oscar's archive is also online now at AA's website, and there's this really interesting Facebook event where Oscar posts every week and he writes about his past experiences, and we're all encouraged to go sort of talk to Oscar and interact with him. But to sort of Ho-Chen's question, you know, we placed the Lo Ting sculpture there sort of as it's an architectural solution, I guess, but it's also a curatorial gesture in that, you know, it's not only just right in the center, you actually see its shadow right in the center. So the first thing that you encounter is actually the shadow of the fishman being sort of projected onto it's actually a book cover of another researcher who's done a lot of research on Lo Ting and on Lantau Island. And I think it's, for us, it's interesting for the audience to sort of see something you seem to know, or like it's recognizable, but you know what it is. And the shadow attracts you to go over to the archive table. And as you sort of take a turn and go sort of behind the shadow, you see a lot more. And I think that's a metaphor for us then. You hear so much about Hong Kong's art, you know, someone said it's like family story or personalized story, and it's very much the case. But I think behind the shadow and the rumors, there's actually a lot more to discover, and that's where the personalizability, I guess, comes from as well. And we want to stage that. And there's a certain affect that you can sort of stage when you discover, when you encounter unknown and then discover more later.
Well, I think we have time for one more question, but just to the issue of family stories. I must admit that was my question. Is that I've always felt that the Hong Kong history is very much like a favorite family story that is told and retold. It is both personal and personizable, to which we can all add our own anecdote, our own story, our own emphasis. And this personal and yet shared and familiar family story is passed down from generation to generation, but somehow it never seems to make the serious history books that focus more on national narratives. It's either never deemed important enough, or it defies or destabilizes those kinds of tidy linear storylines. And I just have this impression from your exhibition that neither do you want to tell a tidy story, but at the end of the day, you're also inviting all of us, both online and elsewhere on site, to tell and retell our own personal stories and imagine new ones going into the future. Now, I want to ask one final question. What question would you have liked to ask Mr. Ha if he were alive today?
I probably would ask him, what makes you think that the collages were, like, people would not be interested? Or why did you keep it to yourself, when everyone wanted to see it? And also I met Ha personally when I was much younger, but I was not sort of formed enough as a person to ask him intelligent questions about his art. I was 10 and 16. Yeah, and I guess what I would also ask him is, how does he see the image making that he was doing, and the record keeping? What were the intricate relationships? Were there any relationship that he was thinking about? Because also, as I'm looking at sort of his other works now, this is what I sort of keep thinking about. Was the record keeping a way of, why do you take so many photographs? I guess would be my question. But really, it is that sort of obsession about sort of keeping a record or documenting, but at the same time, there's so much that speaks with the materials itself, and I would just like to understand that insistence on documenting things through photography. Yeah, it's too many questions. I'm babbling right now.
Don't worry. Did he, just a slightly follow up, did he write, or is he primarily a visual artist, i.e. he documented or diarized in visual forms?
He did write, but the writing are often very aspirational or slogan-like. So, but maybe it's also a very particular type of person would write like that. So I think it really, there's a lot to be done with his biography, and through the biography to find a more nuanced subjectivity in it. So in that sense, as much as the Hong Kong art history doesn't necessarily at this moment in time make it to the serious history books, I think there is a lot to tell from focusing on one artist's life and biography and his oeuvre, to then make it sort of, for the lack of a better word, sort of a significant contribution to the writing of that art history in Hong Kong.
Well, that sounds like a wonderful PhD dissertation. Anyway, I think we need to close now, but I really, Michelle, this has been wonderful. And obviously we all encourage, both Michelle and myself, but we encourage everybody to go to the Asia Art Archive and use the material, look at the material, browse it, research it, and come up with new stories and new ideas. And I'm sure that Michelle would be happy to field questions, and we will send some of the unanswered questions or all the questions to her. And again, I just wanted to thank everybody for joining us tonight. And Michelle, thank you very much for joining us your morning. And thank everybody in the Ha project who may or may not be listening, but that of the wonderful work that was done, and on the not only on the archiving side of it, but also on the exhibition side. But thank you very much, Michelle. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Hillary.
Good night,
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.